This conference will now be recorded.
Thanks, Chuck. We will begin the Building, Zoning, and Development Committee this evening at 7:36 p.m. Present are committee members Williamson, Schuman, and Limpert. Council members Broussard, Osborne, Heeman, and Kelly. Our council president, our mayor, law director, HR director, our planning director, and guests. On the agenda this evening, we have 4 items of legislation. We can begin with 2020-78 and 2020-79. Director Lieber, is it okay if we do those together? Or do we need to do those separately?
I think the discussion can be had together and probably the vote on each piece separate.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So Ordinance 2020-78 is an ordinance providing for the amendment of Chapter 1115, definitions of the codified ordinances of the City of North Olmsted, and 2020-79 is an ordinance providing for the replacement of Chapter 1163, signs of the codified ordinances of the City of North Olmsted. Now, we did just have our public hearing on this. Director, do you want to make one more quick summary and then we can just dive into questions?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think that Ms. Muller's presentation kind of encapsulated what we're hoping to achieve, but I guess to hit a couple high points. We've not dramatically increased the amount of signage allowed to businesses, but we've built in a lot of additional flexibility for businesses. We recognize that a small strip center tenant is not the same as a large scale big box department store and can't be treated with the same set of rules. So we've adjusted, for example, our one wall sign per business, while for a small storefront is fine, does not work if you have a big box with multiple street frontages. So we've taken some of those handcuffs off to recognize the difference in scale between small business and bigger business. We also looked at areas where we granted variances over and over, and usually where you grant variances over and over is a sign that something in your code isn't working correctly. Drive-throughs was an area that we had to address, where businesses were routinely getting variances for 5, 6 ground signs that really just functioned as drive-through equipment. So this is solving that issue. We've had good support from the chamber in this process, good participation on the committee, and generally we've gotten favorable feedback that we're headed in the right direction, I think, in a way that balances business interest with community interest in maintaining a certain aesthetic in our business community. So I'll just leave it at that. If council has questions, I'm happy to answer. Thank you.
Can't hear you, Angela. We can't hear you, Ms. Williamson.
Thank you, Director. Just had a couple of questions of my own, and that would be temporary signs. Now,
For our guests tonight, please hang tight. My guess is that Councilwoman Williamson is calling in on her phone, and we'll be restarting this shortly.
While Ms. Williamson's dialing in, as vice chair, I'm going to take the helm here because I have a question for Ms. Lever. So I'm a little, it's more of a comment, I guess, but I'm a little concerned on the ground sign requirements. I thought there was methods within the sign code that we could limit that. Some of the requirements on that, still providing digital signage, but still keep it in a non-overt way, I guess. You know, just thinking out loud, like we've already, I mean, digital technology has been around for decades, so it's not like it's a new feature. So I don't think it's going to be something that is going to greatly detract from items that are older than, say, 4 decades. I mean, even in our historic district, we have digital signs across from the school for safety reasons. So we're using, you know, digital technology for school crossings, et cetera. So I guess what I'm trying to understand is, are there hard restrictions from us being able to do that? I think you mentioned it in the committee meeting, or the committee as a whole meeting, but I just want to explore that a little further on, are we really overly restricting one specific use case as it relates to signs compared to the rest of the code that I think we've done a tremendous job of providing some flexibility while still keeping good standards and structure?
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. So our proposed code would allow for ground signs to have up to 50% digital sign face, one color, black background, to a message to change once per day. And this is us being conservative and rolling out digital signage with a great concern of enforcement, because, you know, I think we discussed in committee, and we've had other community discussions, that, you know, enforcement is the challenge. So if somebody's operating a digital sign in a way that's overly bright, or the message changes, or it's dynamic or potentially disruptive to neighboring residential areas. So our goal was to step into the digital sign world one step at a time. And then if we need to amend the code down the road and become more liberal, we can certainly do that. I think the restriction of digital signage to not be permitted in a historic district or for a landmark property would be a policy decision. It's one that I recommend as your planning director, and one that I think the committee felt comfortable with because of the unique nature of the structures and buildings that would be considered landmarks or in the district. If it's council's wish to amend that section of the code, you certainly can make that amendment. But it was my recommendation, as we, you know, once a digital sign is out there, it's not coming back. It's grandfathered and it's there forever. So we're taking a conservative approach, especially concerned with the potential impact of digital signs on abutting residential properties, which is, in this case, some of our landmark properties, and certainly our historic district is embedded with residents. And so just additional, I guess, concern for neighbors who might be impacted by light in those areas. So I hope that explains the rationale a little bit more.
Yeah, it does. Madam President, can I follow up? Or, Madam Chair, can I follow up on that?
Mr. Chairman? I even missed your question, so if you plan on making an amendment, I would, you know, you could have waited a minute for me to come back. So I kind of missed where you were at.
I invoke the
take it
vice
over.
chair. In your temporary absence, I invoke the vice chair rules. So just to follow up with that, so are for commercial properties that abut residential properties, are they prevented from having ground signage?
No, they may have digital sign face on their main ground sign.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Lever. I did have a question, though, regarding where I was before. As far as the temporary signs that buildings are putting up, for signage when they're new. How long are those? Some of them have had canvas signs or, you know, the temporary signs across the building. Is there a length of time when they're allowed, for how long they're allowed to keep those up?
Yes, Madam Chair, and I might also ask for Ms. Muller's help in recalling all of our various temporary sign regulations. We do have a table for temporary sign allowances that we've embedded into the code that talks about the various districts, the time limits, the number per lot, the max area, the max height, the types that are permitted, and if a permit's required. So in non-residential districts, there's a variety of temporary signs that are permitted. There's a certain amount of signage that we allow for an unrestricted amount of time. Again, all property owners should have a certain amount of free speech, so we want to allow for some type of free speech year-round, unrestricted. We have additional sign allocation for time-limited periods of 30 days, twice a year. So even though we're not calling out the type of sign or by the type of message, you know, typically that would be where they have a special event or a particular sale or an activity that they're trying to promote. So again, we're not trying to talk about what the message is, but we do have several types, at least 3 types of temporary signs now for commercial areas that have different time durations, but that will allow for some type of free speech in addition to some type of commercial speech. And Wendy, if you have more to add, I'd be happy to have you chime in.
So just as, I mean, again, as Ms. Lieber mentioned, there's a number of provisions in here. The largest, excuse me, the largest of the signs are like 64 square feet, and that is allowed for a maximum of 30 days, twice a year. So that's the kind of, there's time restricted commercial signs that are only allowed in the non-residential district. So again, if there was a now hiring or something like that, so that is very specifically time limited. On the ones that don't have time limits, in the residential districts, the maximum square footage, if it's commercial, would be 8 square feet. So a commercial sign in a residential district, your real estate signs, garage signs, construction, you can think of anything that's kind of advertising an activity or commercial use. In non-residential districts, the maximum unrestricted time is 12 square feet. There are a couple things to consider with that. For the most part, most property owners kind of self-regulate and will hopefully take it down. We do have a general provision that applies to every single temporary sign that says, because of the nature of materials typically used to construct temporary signs and to avoid the unsightliness of deteriorating signs and all safety concerns which accompany such a condition, temporary signs shall be removed and replaced when such a sign is deteriorated. So if somebody wanted to have a I love North Olmsted sign out year round, because that's a, you know, a non-commercial speech, they could, as long as it was in good shape and it was the sign that that meets all these requirements. So the city will have administrative power over deteriorating signs through the general provision.
But would this also encompass, you know, a business name? So just say McDonald's, new business up the street, they have a temporary sign on the building where it's almost like a banner. Mm-hmm. How long is that? It's not illuminated, it's just a banner sign above the door or, you know, on the top of the building. How long are they permitted to keep those there? Or is that again?
They can have up to 12 square feet per 100 lineal feet of building frontage, however long they want.
What is the time frame though? They can keep that up indefinitely?
Correct, because, and let me really quick answer, and I know Lieber wants to answer too. Part of that is recognizing that the various reasons why somebody would need a commercial speech sign. So real estate signs and other types of signs that they might need for longer periods of time, or real estate signs can sometimes be up for an extended period of time. That's why we allow for a very small amount of commercial temporary signs year round or unrestricted time. But it's a maximum of 12 square feet. Ms. Lee.
Director?
I think I understand your question a little bit differently. Are you asking whether a temporary sign can be substituted as a permanent sign, and
Yeah.
for how long?
Yeah.
Okay, so
Thank you.
we do allow 60 days for a banner or temp sign to substitute for a permanent sign for that transition from one business to the next. So there is a time period where it would be allowed of 60 days.
So let me ask this question, and you know the history with a certain property that I've reached out to you about with a number of temporary signs. Who is enforcing these? And are these matters only being enforced as complaint driven? Or maybe I should ask that to Director Gallo. I don't know who I should be asking this to.
Madam Chair, enforcement of the temporary sign code has been a challenge while we have been in this updating process. It might be something our law director might want to weigh in on because we have taken complaints, but I guess I don't want to speak for him in terms of some of the challenges of enforcement of under our current code, and maybe he could better address that for council.
I appreciate that. And let me just add one other question in here while we proceed on this topic. I'm interested in knowing if we can make adjustments to perhaps extend the number of signs or the time length that businesses can utilize. I know this pandemic has had quite an effect on our local businesses, and I know when some of them opened, while I understand they went overboard with their signs, but it was turned into almost a competition down the street of who can get up the most signs and in the the smallest amount of space. So, is there a way that we can perhaps be more lenient during times like this where it's unprecedented, first of all, and I do feel bad for these businesses and trying to get the word out that they are open again, but trying to be mindful too of our codes and everything else there in between. So, Law Director, do you want to take over that then?
Thank you, Councilwoman. Recently, we've had, in terms of enforcement over the past, relatively lengthy period of time, we're trying to juggle the idea of a code rewrite, which has some constitutional deficiencies in it. That when we spoke to issues of differentiating in commercial districts between types of signs, is it a real estate temporary sign? Is it a we're now open temporary sign? All of which can require you to get into content to evaluate, and that's part of the problems with the current status of the law, is that you deal with a bunch of content distinctions to determine who's allowed to have what signs. So I'll be honest with you when I say that we've had some enforcement on placement of temporary signs. We've had some enforcement on the illumination of temporary signs. We've had some enforcement on the physical structure issues. I haven't had a lot where it was about how long it was up or something like that. If it was in a decent shape and it was well maintained, we weren't necessarily going to late while we were doing this code rewrite, weren't necessarily going to go out and try to create new law on the issue of a particular sign. So we did have some enforcement. There has not been in terms of how many or what the condition was, how many there was or what it says or whatnot. We just weren't getting into that. So, and I know it even has come up in some of the residential districts with temporary signs that are political in nature. We've already got complaints about that this year. And the sensitivity of trying to enforce a code with respect to political speech has also been a bit of a challenge. If the sign's illuminated, you're not allowed to illuminate it. If the sign is, if it's got attached to a support structure that's dangerous or it's in bad shape, we have some flexibility to do that. Size is a big issue in terms of how significantly large the sign is. That's been an issue in the past. I think this code cleans that up. I know some of you are familiar with this particular case I'm referring to, but we haven't had a great deal of enforcement cases come forward. But when they do, we take a look at them and we figure out which portions of them we think we can enforce within the bounds of the law.
And as far as penalties,
Under the current code?
under the proposed changes.
All right, hang on. You want to jump in on that one? Jump in on that one?
I didn't see it, so I may have missed it.
Yeah.
The penalties are the same for violate because it's a violation of the zoning resolution or the zoning ordinance. So the violation is your general penalties across the board.
I think it might be in chapter 1117, Michael.
Which I don't have in front of me. I can look it up. I'll let you know. If you guys move on to the next question, I'll jump back and find it.
Okay, I think that does it for me for now. Are there any questions from committee? Mr. Schuman.
Thank you. I sympathize with the businesses. I understand Councilwoman Williamson's comments about being lenient now, but I really think we need to think beyond COVID because this has been a really long process putting this together, and I think we need to think beyond COVID in terms of the legislation before us. I have a couple questions about in regard to political signs or I guess personal opinion signs, I guess you'd call them, on residential property. Do we address flags as part of that, whatever it is, 8 square feet you're allowed to have? Does that enter into it? Maybe Kim or Wendy?
I mean, the flags would be outside of this, particularly because they're related to the structure that they're on.
Okay, I think, I don't know if you understand what I'm saying. I'm not talking about an American flag. I'm talking about an opinion flag. And I mean, if you have a flag, can you, if we're not, I'm not really sure here. If we're not changing what we have now, right now, you're allowed to have an opinion sign of 8 square feet. And you're allowed 1 up until 30 days before the election. And then I think you're allowed to go to 5. But if you have an opinion sign and then you have a flag also with a similar opinion, or even if it's another opinion, I think that's something we ought to address.
So I'll start, and this may be where the law director may want to step in, or Kim as well. But part of the touchy issue and why we were fairly hands-off with and we call it non-commercial speech, which could be opinion, it could be political. It's anything that is not basically a commercial activity or advertisement of commercial activities, etc. The reason why we've generally been hands-off is that's a very touchy subject to begin with, whether it's a flag of the United States, whether it's a political or an opinion. And so we focused on what types were allowed, again, what types of signs are, and keeping them out of the right-of-way, but not in the maximum number of them. With part of that idea is that for the most part, most people tend to self-regulate. Are there people out there that might go overboard? Yes, but from the standpoint of like a risk assessment from being challenged in court over this freedom of speech, we thought that was the safest approach.
Okay. I mean, I already have a headache and we're 2 months out. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I think most of us Most of the residents do, but and it's just going to get crazier and crazier.
I will share with you very quickly. One of the approaches that we could have taken is just to have an overall limitation on the number of signs and just not even talk about commercial versus non-commercial. And there was actually a great concern because what's that magic number? And then in that case, you would have to allow, you could have somebody have, 5 real estate signs or, whatever number we came up with.
Sure.
As I recently learned, our courts love to tell you when we're wrong in the maximum, but they won't tell you the minimum. We have to, they give us one side of things and say that's not enough, but then they won't tell us, well, what is? So the concern with, just saying, well, we're not even going to get into commercial versus non-commercial is that we would have to come up with a number, and probably no matter what number we came with or the total area, when it comes to a controversial election or other controversial times, chances there's going to be a lot of people in violation of it. So that's one of the things we took into consideration is that kind of issue.
I thought they were all controversial elections, but that's just an opinion. I could probably put that sign out in front of my house. Another question I had is, we talk about maintenance, or not maintenance, but keeping an eye on these temporary signs in regard to businesses. I've seen a lot of times when businesses will put them up on Friday afternoon or Friday evening for the weekend and then have them down by Monday, knowing full well that there's nobody out taking these things down. And they'll put them all over the mall or put them all over tree lawns, whatever. Kind of a concern. I know that that's not necessarily something that can be addressed here, but I guess it's something that we should kind of talk about how we can kind of maybe slow businesses down from doing that. I realize you don't want to like hamper anybody right now, but we got to look past this. So, Kim, you got an answer for that one?
Well, Mr. Schuman, I understand and can appreciate the concern. I know building shares that concern, that especially those that live in and around North Olmsted will see that sometimes occur. So we have to have some enforcement then at times of the day or days of the week when these signs pop up. So I think in part it's we'll have to identify some times where we can have after hours or evening enforcement by inspectors, and or we've also tried to use the letter technique where if we're aware of something from council, we'll send somebody, a business owner, a letter or communication indicating what our local ordinances are and ask them to comply, assuming that they maybe just don't know. But what we find out is we tend to have frequent flyers, that have been told and told and told. So that's where we need to probably actually have inspectors, witness and send out the notices of violation. But again, we're kind of in this murky in-between times of not sure if our code was constitutionally defensible in terms of our temporary sign distinction. So taking these matters to law kind of resulted in us wondering what the success would be. So once the new code's in place, I think we'll have a much better place to start for enforcement of issues like that you bring up.
Thank you, Madam Chair. That's about all I got.
Thank you. Law Director, do you have a?
Thank you. Thank you, Councilwoman. The follow-up to the question about the penalties is they are minor misdemeanors. There's a couple different sections under 112103. Minor misdemeanors up to $150 and no jail. There's 2 different sections. There's a little bit of a deviation between each one, but they do allow for per diems. So each and every day is a separate offense as it goes on. We tend not to necessarily charge them that way, but on occasion we do. It just depends on if they've been given the order, if they complied with the order, if they blew off the order, then we might have a different view on how we prosecute that versus just a one-time offense and then a correction. So it is a minor misdemeanor as to answer the question about the penalty section of it.
Thank you. Director Lieber, Mr. Broussard, I do see your hand up. I just have one additional question before I forget. Has there been any kind of portion that it will address vehicles in parking lots? I know that that's becoming a new way of advertising without having a ground sign. Some are quite large, some are quite colorful. Is there anything that addresses that? And so, Ms.
Yes.
Moeller or Director Lieber?
There is. Our new section, I'm trying to find the exact.
I got it for you.
Okay, 116306.
Yeah.
Q.
6306Q.
There's a much more substantial code section now that addresses and defines vehicle signs that's improved over our current code. So yes, we did. We had shared the same concerns about the creativity of some businesses. So it defines a vehicle sign, or discusses a vehicle sign as vehicle signs viewed from a public road with the primary purpose of advertising through signage not otherwise allowed by this chapter. A vehicle sign shall be considered to be used for the primary purpose of advertising if the vehicle or trailer has signage attached to it and fails to display current license plates or registration, or the vehicle or trailer is inoperable and has signage attached to it. Also, we have a second section: vehicles or trailers shall not be parked continuously in one location to be used primarily as additional signage. There's some exemptions, like if it's a vehicle parked at a residence, and so that's somebody's place of employment. It's a fleet or delivery vehicle that's actively used as part of the business, or it's used as a person by their personal means of transportation. So yes, we did think about those things in this update and did include more robust language around that.
Thank you. Mr. Broussard?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think everybody's going to roll their eyes and probably want to kill me, but I want to circle back again to the temporary sign code as it relates to non-commercial in residential, specifically the political signs, because frankly, after sitting through the presentation and hearing the Q&A, it's still as clear as mud to me right now, because we've got an ongoing issue in Ward 1 where we've got side-by-side homes that appear both to be in violation of our current ordinances. Both of them are greater than 8 square feet, and they've been up for 2+ months, if not longer. And so I guess my question is about enforcement, because nobody is going to listen to me if I just tell them we're taking a hands-off kind of policy on that. So if somebody could explain that to me, enforcement today versus when, assuming this gets enacted. Thank you.
To Mr. Broussard's question, the future code, and I'm not sure that this came across clearly, there'll be an unlimited number of signs permitted on any commercial or residential lot. We've eliminated the number of signs for non-commercial speech, so for free speech items. We do have a size limitation, but for an unlimited time, there could be an unlimited number. And that was, again, a decision the committee came to, because what is the number that is defensible in court? And a reliance on self-policing to some extent. So I can't speak so much to the current enforcement. I think the concern was the distinction that we make in our code amongst different content types, whereas the content distinctions of certain types of temporary signs like real estate signs is gone. So now we do have a distinction of commercial speech and non-commercial speech, but we believe that to be defensible. And so, if any one sign exceeds the size, then that will be, that could be enforced, but there won't be a number and there won't be a time limit.
Thank you, Director. Madam Chair, if I could continue. Thank you. So all right, it's becoming clearer. But I guess the question of the size of these signs is still unresolved, because one of them is at least 8 foot by 12 foot, in my estimation. The other one is probably 4 foot by 4 foot attached to the house. The other one is 8 foot by 12 foot-ish with a light illuminating it in the front yard. So what kind of enforcement do we have available to us today? And this has nothing to do with the content, by the way. I could care less about the content of either of those signs. But I am getting calls and a lot of people upset about both being apparently over the permitted size that we allow today. So what are we doing about enforcement of that today? Thank you.
To Councilmember Broussard's question, I'll have to defer that to the law director.
Madam Chairwoman?
Go ahead.
Thank you. Again, in terms of the portions of the code that are currently, I think, defensible and enforceable, it's not even this code, but it's the general code in the sign code, is concerns illumination in the residential district is something that I feel that we can proceed with most comfortably right now. You may recall that the city of North Olmsted has a history of litigation with respect to our own sign code enforcement. About 20 years ago, we went through one of these. So I won't say that we're overly cautious, but at the same time, we're cognizant of the fact that this does concern political speech. Political speech is protected at a higher level than commercial speech. It's a stricter scrutiny that is used when you have a code that deals with this particular class of speech. When you have a frailty in your code, as I believe that we do, that's why we're passing this code, I think it leaves you open and subjected to not only a defense to criminal prosecution, but also leads to potential civil liability. So we are reticent at this point in terms of our current code status to attempt to enforce this particular section with a brand new code coming in, which we believe will be subject to constitutional scrutiny and will survive constitutional scrutiny. Whereas there is at least some portions of our current code that I think, and again, if you're weak as to one portion of it, you're weak as to all of it, that at least afford us potential liability and a non-successful prosecution. Again, there are some of the physical components of it, they are enforceable. In terms of the illumination, and there was some other sections about how it was if it's dangerous in terms of how it's being presented. But in terms of the code, as it applies now toward the size of the signs, there has not been any enforcement of the particular size component based upon some of the First Amendment concerns and the weaknesses of our current code. But let me say further, I mean, we keep in mind this situation arises at a time when I've been sitting there at these meetings for a year now, and but for COVID, these would have been up and running. And another thing is we haven't had the history of political signs in North Olmsted is everybody always thought there was a code that said you couldn't put a sign out 30 days before an election. Everybody believed that this was some sort of a rule in North Olmsted. It wasn't a rule in North Olmsted for political signs. It was just what they called the gentleman's agreement. Everybody agreed, we don't need campaign signs littering up the neighborhoods, and bigger isn't always better, and we just don't need that. So everybody kind of followed a standard. Let's be reasonable about it. Put your sign out, the beginning of October, and then move on. But that didn't. Now that rule no longer applies. It wasn't a codified rule. It was a simple way of behavior. We've never had, Councilman, somebody put up an 8 foot by 12 foot political sign in North Olmsted. We're running into that now. Am I still there?
Yes.
Yes.
Am I back?
Yes.
Okay, I'm not sure where I was. Something went wrong. Either I went down or something else did. But I'll stop at this. I'll just say that I think that we're in a position now where we can more securely enforce it. We've never historically had this type of situation arise, and when it arises in the future, we'll be better prepared to address it. We haven't had in the past 8 foot by 12 foot signs up in people's yards. we will have a code that will allow us to better police this type of activity in a way that will survive constitutional analysis. So that's kind of where we are. That's what brought us to where we are.
Director, may I ask this question of you? And it's kind of, it's along the same topic, but what about, as Councilman Broussard mentioned, you know, the neighbors having these competing signage here. If one of those residents were to go over to the other's home and remove a sign, what type of penalties are there?
It could be anything from criminal damaging to trespass to theft, and if that happens, they'll be prosecuted. It's the same thing if you walk onto somebody's property and swipe a regular yard sign. If you get caught and we catch you and it comes to me, you'll be prosecuted. So we don't have self-help. Yeah, we don't have self-help. If someone doesn't like the sign that you know, Bob's got up in his yard, it's no license to go take it down. And if you do it and you get caught and it comes to me, you'll be prosecuted.
That's all I was asking. Thank you so much. Mr. Broussard?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm just being a little bit snarky. I believe there's a precedent for that about 2 election cycles ago. Thank you.
Yeah, well.
Are there any other questions from Mr. Glassburn? You may proceed.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First thing I would like to request or note is when we're dealing with something that that has so many technical changes and is 20 pages of technical specifications, for the definitions, there's a track changes version, so to speak, but for the actual ordinance, that's at least not the way that it was presented for what I received. So if there is a version of that, or if there can be a version of that actually shows the changes in each area, I would find that very useful. On a second point, I know we have 2 council members who live very close to Butternut. I grew up on Butternut Ridge Road. I'm not sure the difference between regulating an LED light on the marathon versus them having a giant poster for Monster Energy in terms of its aesthetic appeal. So I think that it's hard. It's really hard to make the argument that gas station or the pinball shop, or for matter the church further north, will inherently damage the integrity of the rest of the homes beyond what already has been done. I guess one of the other questions I have is, how are we going to inform whatever changes are made? How are we going to inform the businesses and residents of all of these changes? Because these are not intuitive standards. They're very specific. They seem to be negotiated. And so I would like to know how we're going to inform everyone of whatever standards we put in place for this new version. And that's to whoever is most appropriate to answer.
Madam Chair, I can answer those questions. I'll start with your last question first. The last part of the project, once it's adopted, is to put together an informative brochure or handout that will briefly relay some of the highlighted changes, and that we'll be able to, we haven't discussed yet how we'll distribute it amongst our business community, but we've had quite a broad stakeholder base that we've kept informed through emails, and especially we know those that have been most interested in issues of signage. We can consider, you know, dropping one by each business, or, you know, sending to main property owners and disseminating some way. But there is an information campaign that will happen after adoption. I actually believe that our code will be simpler for businesses. The calculations will be more simple. The signage allocations for those with drive-throughs will be more reasonable. And not, the basics aren't changing in terms of height of your ground sign, area of your ground sign. You know, some of the things our businesses have been very familiar with for years and years. Like, we didn't want to change it so dramatically that it would throw a lot of businesses into non-compliance. So, we deal with sign questions that come into the City Hall every day, and we've already had a lot of interest in businesses that are waiting for the new code to install their new signs. In terms of the track changes, we started that way, and by the end, it was so alphabet soup, full of different colors of ink that you couldn't read it anymore because we changed so many sections around fairly dramatically in order and in text. So what I can offer is to just prepare a little chart of what some of the main changes are from the old code to the new code, of like current code says this, new code says that. But to track changes, I think would not make it more clear, it would make it more confusing. So I'll be happy to outline something for council.
Thank you, Director. I think that would be helpful as well, because I was wondering the same thing with these, with the two versions, and trying to figure out where the track changes was. So, Mr. Glassburn, did you have any additional questions? Yes, go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I guess it's my last comment or comments are more of just stating my opinion. I'm very reluctant to regulate any signage, whether it's political, commercial, or in between, if it doesn't have something specifically to do with safety or obscenity. And so, I mean, it just, I'm not trying to find ways to be problematic on this, but, again, going back to, for example, the LED question. I mean, Christmas lights are LEDs. I mean, this church in question could literally project for Christmas LEDs covering their entire church. People have bright lights in their homes. I don't know how we can. It feels arbitrary to me, and I'm not sure just that it's too bright for the neighbors is quite there on the safety criteria. So I'm willing to be open and listen to more, but it's hard for me to get behind that. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Ms. Mueller, you may. I saw your hand up.
Sorry, I have two computers because I want to be able to see your faces, and my laptop wouldn't let me see the video. So I did want to respond a little bit to that, just for our purposes of clarification. When we're talking about the LEDs that were specifically referenced in this, they're related to a specific type of sign that's pretty well defined, which is an electronic message center. And so that's not just about the light type. So it's not dealing with the Christmas lights or the LED lights that somebody might put in a canopy, in a gas canopy or whatever. It is tied to a very specific type of sign technology, which is what you saw in my presentation when I had the example of, I believe it was a church digital sign, or what you see used for gas prices. Those are considered electronic message centers and are distinct from a cabinet sign that might have an LED light fixture in it. So that's kind of an important distinction. So when we were talking about what types of signs aren't allowed in historic districts or landmarks, it's the electronic message center, not about the use of LED lighting fixtures.
Mr. Glassburn, do you have any additional questions or comments?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll just say, again, I'm trying to find a rational demarcation line here, because if this church has a message board already that they manually put letters on the board and they illuminate it, backlit it with an LED, what is the difference? I'm not getting it. So I'm sorry. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Anyone care to respond? Councilwoman Heeman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I kind of agree that, regulating a church and not letting them have the type of signage that they're looking for seems a little bit of a hypocrisy, since we actually have a digital message sign. Not in the historic district exactly, but we are the owners of one right at our city hall. So I think that for a building business like the church to want to switch in the future and for us to prohibit them seems unfair and unnecessary, since they do have a sign already that so they're not. I guess my point is they're not permitted to advance with technology as other businesses are, and that doesn't seem appropriate to me at all. Thank you.
Are there any additional comments, questions? Mr. Limpert.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. I think I would like to propose amendment to this related to the landmarks. And I know this doesn't make me the most popular person on the landmarks committee, but I think there certainly is some benefit to keeping a standard when it comes to ground signage as opposed to specifications on the building itself. So I think it's important that if we do that the restrictions on the building itself should maintain consistent with landmark standards. But I think when it comes to ground signage, that's something that is a separate entity from the building. And I think we should look to amend to keep that in compliance with other sign standards that we have for ground signage.
Councilwoman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate that, Councilman Limpert, and I would be in favor of that amendment as well. Thank you.
Chairwoman, it appears we've lost your audio again.
That's because I had it on mute. Thank you. Law Director, what is your suggestion for the amendment that Councilman Limpert had suggested?
Thank you. Look, we know where you're coming from, Director Wendy. We understand the question that you posed and the position that you're taking. So let's give us a little bit of time to draft some language. If you wish to make an amendment to move it out of committee, you can make a motion to first make a motion to recommend with an amendment. And if you use that amendment and state it in such a way, we know what you're trying to do. Yes, Director Liebert, you understand where we're going, what they want to do with this. Wendy, you'd also know. So we can then draft it, circulate it to you in the new version, and then if that's not sufficient, then we can play with it from there. I see Director Liebert has her hand up.
Thank you. I'd like to clarify, is the desire for the amendment to eliminate landmark properties from the restriction, or not to place any restriction on historic districts as well?
I think it would be specifically to landmarks, because in my view, a landmark is something that you're bestowing on something in recognition, and also in and not that a sign makes or breaks a building, but I think ultimately you want to support that landmark to be viable and consistent for as long as possible, so it can continue to be a landmark in your city. So my thought would be, for my amendment, would be to landmarks specifically, given that we have a broader structure as it relates to historic districts, and I think there's a lot of other guidelines as it relates to a historic district. So my thought would be for landmarks is what my specific amendment's for. Now, other people may have something later that they'd want to propose, but mine would be for landmarks.
Councilman, what if we put in a provision within the code section that there could be an appeal process for properties in that area, rather than opening it up would that be feasible? Or, I mean, they could appeal it
I mean, there's
to
a
council, or, I mean, I'm just throwing
really
it out
appeals
there. Really.
process. I mean, there's an appeals
Just-
process for anything, right, Director? So my thought would be to get something that it's more common with the other guidelines, as opposed to just opening up for then another review group to make that decision, because you've already now delineated them as being different, and now you're taking to appeals group with them having some stricter criteria, which already, you know, puts them at somewhat of a disadvantage when it comes to the appeals process.
Understood. Director Lieber, and then Ms. Neiman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The appeal process would necessarily go to the Building and Zoning Board of Appeals, but you know, if council were to adopt the ordinance as is, and it would have language that specifically excluded landmarks from the digital sign phase, I think it would be hard for the BZBA to then find the grounds to grant that. So I think if council, if your intent is to allow landmarks to have digital sign phase, just eliminating the language, the few words in that code section would be the way to go, rather than using the BZBA. Thank you.
Councilwoman.
And
Ms.
thank
Seaman.
you, Madam Chair. I would agree with eliminating it, and the reason is because I've gone to some of those landmarks appeal process, and it's challenging because, you know, I think we all know my opinion on our historic district, right? They have no budget, so those folks get nothing except rules that sometimes don't make it possible for them to live in their homes, even though their home could never have a landmark on it because it's not old enough. So that's a mixed bag, in my opinion, and too difficult, I think, to rein in. I would not be in favor of an appeal process, and I would prefer that it just be removed with regard to that. And if I can ask Director Lieber, so the CVS and the gas station would be grandfathered because they exist already, and they're really the only other two pieces of property that along that whole butternut area are kind of just, I don't know why they aren't just carved out, but they're not. So as long as they can exist the way that they are, you know, I'm okay with that part. Thank you.
Okay, so moving forward, Mr. Limbert, how do you propose we?
So thank you, Madam Chair. I got one final question. So digital signage as it relates to the building structures and the building structures, irregardless of being a landmark, so just regular commercial signage, is there permissible digital signage on the structure currently?
No.
Okay. Yeah. So my proposal would be to amend the code proposed definitions and remove landmarks from the restriction of digital signage as it relates to ground signage. So it would just bring it in line with commercial properties.
Councilman Schuman?
Mr. Schuman.
Thank you, both of you. Isn't it there a specific mention of churches in the code in regard to these signs? There is not. Okay. Okay, then I guess that's the only way you can do it, is to remove landmarks, unless you were to mention churches as being appropriate.
I'm going to step in and we had some discussions about this. Part of the court cases, it's, you know, I told you, you know, what it comes down to is you can't read the message. The other place that communities get in trouble is when they give certain speakers more speech than somebody else. So you could be seen as giving churches more different speech than somebody else in that's another landmark in another district or whatever. So I would avoid calling out specific uses and giving them more.
Yeah, and I think mine's more to landmarks than it is to just being a specific church. I think signage is separate from the historic nature of the building and the structure itself. I think you evolve over time, and I don't think the signage would detract from the historical significance or representation of the building. So the proposal is really more on the landmark property that you're bestowing this recognition on, and I think you want to do what you can to recognize that, keep that consistent, but also allow it to be a sustainable piece of property. So that's all I had to say. Thank you. So do you want me to propose an amendment then, Madam Chair?
Yes, you can make an motion to do that, how you want to do that. And then, Director, would that be ready for our next meeting? Do you suggest that we hold this in committee, meet once more, and then put it on? Or how do you?
I think we can draft this language pretty quickly between the three of us. This is something that, it's a pretty easy rewrite. So we can get it to you, and it's not going to surprise anybody when it shows up. You're going to get pretty much the exact language being removed and nothing further. So I don't think we need to hold it in committee. If you folks are good with it, let's advance it with the notation that it's approved with the amendment, and the amendment being, as I understood Councilman Limpert, the amendment being to basically remove any restriction upon landmark properties for purposes of digital signage, ground signage, right? So whatever
That's
that
exactly
language,
right.
whatever has to be switched, we'll switch it. No matter if it's in two sections, we'll take it out of two sections. Wherever that language lives, we'll amend that affected language to ensure that landmark properties are not prohibited from using a digital sign face. That sounds like a motion, doesn't it?
So moved.
Yeah, it's great. Mr. Glassburn?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I also will become the most popular councilman, I'm sure, but after hearing more on this tonight, I'm likely to offer or try to formulate amendments on this, but I'm not prepared to do that entirely this evening. So if holding in committee would make that a more orderly process, I would love to try to cooperate with that. If it's moving forward, I'll try to have things ready as fast as I can for the floor, but I want to try to not unnecessarily complicate the process beyond expressing the amendments. If that makes sense.
What amendments, may I ask, do you have an idea? I mean, are there multiple? Or are they just a couple, or which?
So
I'm just trying to get an idea of what we're looking at.
As I think I somewhat stated before, my personal bias is to not regulate signs unless there's a safety or some kind of obscenity or vulgarity issue. But with the free speech signs, with the message signs, I think our attempts to regulate these items are problematic. Cities continuously lose these political speech regulation cases over and over and over again. I don't want us to be in a situation where we're playing another round of we try to regulate something and then we get sued. So again, with 20 pages of changes so complex we can't do track changes, it would be nice to be able to spend a little more time to try to be thoughtful on crafting any changes.
Thank you. Mr. Schuman?
Since we are being promised some track of these changes, then I would suggest that we should hold in committee. Perhaps we can wait on all these amendments. Thank you.
Director Lieber, is there an urgency or when are you anticipating or hoping that this gets passed? Are we on a timeline?
Madam Chair, I guess our timeline has long been exceeded from what we had hoped and planned. We do get communications from businesses regularly, I would say weekly, asking when the updates will be passed because the majority of these changes do benefit our business community. So I think the urgency is just in being responsive to these businesses that have been participating in this process, but certainly a week or two is not, at this point, a concern of mine.
So perhaps we could reconvene on the 22nd. Does that give everyone a good enough time to come up with recommended changes, and then we can discuss those in committee again? I know Councilman Limpert will go ahead and take care of yours, and perhaps we just do that all in one bunch, but Councilman Glassburn, you'll have your changes. Would you be able to get those through to Chuck prior to our committee so we can have an opportunity? Perfect, to review it. Okay, and then Director, we'll just hold off on Councilman Limpert's for now and revisit that then on the 22nd as well?
Just,
Madam
Chairman, I would suggest just make a motion to hold in committee. I would ask that because these are fairly technical legal issues, that if you have some proposed amendments, if you could perhaps consider getting them to myself or Kim so we can review them with Wendy, because in an effort to try to, when you begin to remove certain types of speech from regulation, you're actually creating classes of speech that are being given different protections, and you may very well run into a content-based violation. So, when you decide you're going to remove somebody or someone or some speech, you've read that speech and you've determined who that speaker is, and then you've given them a different class of treatment, and you may run into the very problem that you think you're trying to avoid when you make that proposal. So if you can get that to us in advance, that would help us to determine whether or not we're going to be having a 2-minute meeting or a 15-minute meeting, because we'll need to make sure that those suggested changes are not going to be suspect. So if anyone has that, if you could do that. Dwayne, yours is easy, but if Chris has some, Director Limpert, yours is easy. If Director Glassburn has some that he'd like to send our way, Councilman, I elevated you. Councilman Limpert and Councilman Glassburn, if you could get that to us in advance, I certainly would appreciate that.
I don't know if that's a promotion or a demotion.
Yeah, I think it might have been a demotion.
Okay,
Madam Chair, could I just say one more?
They send them to Chuck, and then Chuck can forward on to Director Lieber and Director Garreau. Sound good? Okay. Then at this time, I will make a motion to hold 2020 78 and 79 and ask for a second.
Second.
Seconded by Mr. Limpert. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Okay, and that motion passes with a vote of 3-0. The next item on the agenda is 2020-98.
Madam Chairman?
Yes.
Could I ask that the task force also receive copies of the proposed amendments? The task force that worked on putting this ordinance together in the first place?
Where did Director Garreau go?
Madam Chair,
Yes.
I have no problem sharing changes with the committee.
Pardon me?
I have no problem sharing the proposed changes with the committee so that they have the information before your next council meeting as well.
Okay. Okay,
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, so as I was at 2020-98, an ordinance amending section 1345.05 of chapter 1345 of the building code entitled Standards for Private Residential Pools to incorporate standards established by the International Code Council for pools, spas, and hot tubs installed at residential properties. Director Lever, would you like to take over this matter?
We just lost Director Lieber, Madam Chair.
Madam Chair, Director Gallo was having some technical issues. Can you unmute, whoever's in charge of that, can you unmute her? There was a phone issue.
Thank you, Chuck. I have good news. Mine are just two simple housekeeping measures. So 2020-98 is this section of our code with this change directly references the International Swimming Pool and Spa Code. And what this change does is it brushes up the wording to eliminate the out-of-date reference to the appendix, which no longer exists, and provides reference to the new title of the swimming pool chapter. I'm not requesting suspension or an emergency clause.
Okay. Are there any questions from committee? Council? Anyone? I'm kidding. All right, then I will make a motion to recommend approval to all of council and ask for a second.
Second.
Seconded by Mr. Limpert. All in favor, say aye.
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 Okay, and that motion passes with a vote of 3-0. The last item on the agenda is Ordinance 2020-99, which is an ordinance amending and reestablishing Section 1359.09 of Chapter 1359 of the Building Code entitled Maintenance of Unoccupied Commercial Buildings in order to establish the appeal process from an order of the Building Commissioner. Director Gallo.
Thank you, Madam Chair. In Exhibit A, it shows Section C, and all we are doing here is taking out that the owner may appeal to the director and putting the building commissioner in there. This was updated prior with prior legislation, and Section C just wasn't updated at that time. And one of our inspectors actually caught this and brought it to our attention. So we just wanted to change director to the building commissioner, have them reference the building commissioner in that section.
Okay. Any questions from committee? Council? No one? All right. I will make a motion to recommend approval to all of council and ask for a second.
Second.
Seconded by Mr. Limpert. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye. Okay, that motion
Aye.
passes with a vote of 3-0. And our meeting concludes at 8:49 p.m. Yay. Bye.
Can we go home
Thank
now?
you.
Director Gallo,